Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my reaction channel. My name is Teddy90, and today we're going to be reacting to Is the EU Democratic, and Does Your Vote Matter? By Kurtzgesagt, in a nutshell. Everybody knows Kurtzgesagt. Everybody loves Kurtzgesagt. They make great content. Go sub, go like, do everything else like that. They deserve all the love, happiness, and everything else like that in the world. They put so much effort into their animations and everything else like that, and I'm just some lazy schmuck who reacts to it. Now on to the EU idea. I'm personally for the EU. I'm Canadian, just so you know. I'm personally for the EU just because I believe unity of countries is better for countries than disunity and nationalism. Because, at least in my mind, having individualist, nationalistic countries tends to create more friction than a united front. And when countries are united, now, whether or not the EU is good or bad is up to you, but I'm for the unification. But when you're united, you're more able to argue for better trade deals, you're more able to defend yourselves, you're more able to tell bigger nations like Russia, the US, China to go fuck themselves, you're more able to keep yourself separate. So you lose some of your own identity by doing it, but you also gain the added security of being part of a greater community, and the fact that you can actually defend yourself from others instead of just becoming someone else's bitch. Now, of course, is the EU particularly good? I'm not an EU citizen. I'm personally for the EU, but granted, I don't know the inner workings of the EU. I know the EU isn't super democratic, and I know it's mostly controlled by Benelux and Germany, but yeah, so let's jump into it. Let's see what Kurtzgesagt has to say.
Being a citizen of the European Union means that many aspects of our lives are regulated by a weird entity. It feels like a huge bureaucracy is making decisions over our heads. Many Europeans think that their vote in the EU elections doesn't count and that the EU is not democratic. How democratic is the EU really? And does your vote actually achieve anything? In democratic states, public policies are based on the will of the people. But the people are not a coherent thing. Countless different groups are battling for influence and power to establish laws and rules that benefit them.
Yeah.
In a working democracy, there are checks and balances that are supposed to create a fair environment where these battles can be fought. Term limits stop factions from dominating too much. But all of this ends at our borders. International politics are not democratic, but anarchic. No central authority is powerful enough to ensure fairness or enforce laws, so the only law is the tyranny of the strongest and anarchy.
Yeah.
So for most of human history, powerful countries took what they wanted from others, either by extortion or by violence.
The strong take what they want, the weak suffer what they must. That's a common phrase. I can't remember who said it, but that is a common phrase and idea when it comes to international politics. That's why I, again, believe that unity is more important. Again, whether or not the EU is good, but things like the EU have to exist for smaller countries. They just have to, especially with countries with lower population density. Canada is fucked because we're right next to the United States, so we automatically become their bitch. Although we're kind of becoming China's bitch right now, so hopefully we can stop that. But if you have the ability and choice to unify with somebody else, it's better for your country if you're a smaller country to do so, because you don't have the ability to defend yourself. You don't have the ability to argue for yourself and be able to get good trade deals and everything else like that. Like, look at the Ukraine. The Ukraine is basically getting bent over by Russia, and obviously Russia won't allow it to join the EU. But if the Ukraine joined the EU, they'd be in a much better position because they'd have everybody else defending them. Like, that's what is required. Like, there's so many people who think, oh, our country needs to go our own way, and then their country ends up getting railroaded up the ass by China or Russia or the US, and it's like, I don't know what you expected, but maybe yeah, I don't know.
After World War II, the United Nations were founded to overcome this anarchy by establishing rules on how countries should behave. But since the UN has virtually no power...
True, because you have two massively authoritarian governments on it. And the US. Russia, China, and the US. We should have a rotating Security Council. Having manual Security Council people, and with them having... Or not manual, with a permanent security member... Security Council members is ridiculous. Because all it does is incentivize the ability of the bigger members being able to tell other smaller members to go fuck themselves. Again, I'm all for unity, but the unity has to be good. So, again, is the UN particularly good? No, it needs to be either reformed, abolished, and then reinstated. You know what I mean? Like, it as it is right now, it's completely useless and needs to be rehauled or demolished and then rebuilt. Whether or not the EU needs the same, I'm not sure, but big things like this, like the UN, are required.
Its members often have opposing interests, it's usually politely ignored.
No.
The EU is a construct that tries to have rules and laws for its member nations that are actually enforceable, as the European Court of Justice is able to make binding decisions. Originally, the EU was founded to ensure peace between European nations and prosperity for the continent. But it's also an attempt to gain international power for its members. It's like a superstate, and it's striving to be democratic and legitimized by all of its citizens. To do that, it has to solve the problem of different actors wanting different things, only that its members are countries with very different priorities. So, how does this work? Since the EU is ridiculously complex, and politicians are even worse than scientists at naming things, we'll simplify massively and omit a lot of details. You can find further reading and explanations in our sources document. Okay, if you want to create a democratic union of independent nations, you have two options. 1. Let everybody vote for national politicians who then make decisions for the union together. Or 2. Let every citizen vote directly for an independent institution that's able to make binding decisions. Both approaches have their upsides and downsides, and the EU ended up with a mix of both of them. Next to the European Court of Justice, there are 4 main institutions that we'll talk about today. The European Council, which is made up of the heads of government or states of the member countries. The Council of the EU, with ministers from the member countries. The third one is the European Commission, which is the de facto government of the EU, having one commissioner for each member state. And lastly, the European Parliament. The Parliament is the only part of the EU that is directly elected by you, dear citizen, in the European elections. In principle, all of these institutions of the EU originate from your direct or indirect vote, be it at the national or EU level. But some do more than others. For example, you vote for your national representative and therefore contribute to form a national government whose head of state has a seat in the European Council. These leaders choose the President of the EU Commission and its fellow commissioners, who eventually are confirmed by the EU Parliament. So this is a sort of indirect democracy. You didn't vote for the Commission, but you voted for the people who appointed them and for those who confirmed and policed them. So in effect, 2.5 of the 4 main European Union institutions depend on the member state governments. But since you, as a citizen, can only directly vote for the European Parliament, the question is, how powerful is it? How much influence does your vote have? The European Parliament started out with very little influence, but has become more and more powerful over the past 2 decades. Today, it has to approve new laws, which can be binding for the member countries. It also votes on how the EU budget is spent and on international treaties. All of this makes the Parliament very powerful and thus your vote very influential, even on an international level. Compared to national parliaments, one major power is still missing though. The EU Parliament officially can't propose new laws on its own, which is often the core of the argument that the EU is not democratic enough and that the European Parliament should be given more influence. Right now, the member states' governments pretty much control the European Union. Giving the Parliament more power would make the EU as a whole more democratic, but it would also take power from member states. It's not clear which approach is better. Ultimately, it's for the member states and us as citizens to decide how the Union should develop. Okay, so can we draw a conclusion here? As a whole, the EU is not as democratic as most of its member states, but it is democratic. If you don't like decisions they make, regarding copyright for example, you can look up what your representatives voted for and vote them out. The struggle to make it more democratic is closely tied to who holds power over what. The EU keeps changing. You, dear citizen, are not only voting on the current politics, but also on what the system will look like in the future. There are many partisan politicians that vowed to make the EU Parliament, and therefore your vote, stronger. Many others want to keep it as it is, or even diminish it. It's for you to decide what you think is better for the future of the Union. Currently, it's equally important for the EU who you vote for at home, because these are the people who have the most influence in the European Union right now. Opinion. At home is also where the EU is often used as a scapegoat. Politicians, especially before national elections, like to pretend the EU is all-powerful and makes up rules and laws over the heads of the governments and citizens, although often they were directly responsible for what the EU did. Democracy is annoying and complicated and often very boring. In the European Union, even more so than in the member states. But voting and caring about how our political institutions change and develop is one of the most powerful things we can do as citizens. The last few years have shown that extreme things can happen through elections. We have to decide if we want to be an active part of this process. If we don't take part in the struggle for power that is politics, others will. And we might not like what they decide for us. Because Europe is an important topic for us, we've translated this video into as many
That's one of the biggest things when it comes to democracy. If you don't put forward your vote, if you don't vote, you're worthless. You're a completely worthless citizen to the government you're pretending you care about. If you don't put your voice forward in a democracy, you aren't helpful to your democracy. You're actively hindering your democracy. You need to vote. You need to put your voice forward. And I'm firmly on the side of the idea that the EU Parliament should have infinitely more power than the heads of state and all the other more indirect forms of voting. But of course, that then comes up with the idea of that then removes a lot of national sovereignty and makes the EU a government. If you do that, if you give more power to the Parliament, what you are then doing is taking away power from your own government and giving it to the EU and saying the EU is our government. The EU is now our government. That is what we are voting for, and that is what we want. Of course, the other side is more national power. So, like your national state, like Germany, Spain, whatever, they have more power in the EU. So your own state has more say, but it comes at the cost of it being less democratic and feeling like it's less democratic. So if you want the EU to be more democratic, you have to accept that your country itself is going to slowly be absorbed into the EU. If you accept that, then the Parliament having more power is good. If you accept the fact that your country is just going to become part of the EU, it's going to become less and less of its own country, and it's just going to become the EU. You're just a citizen of the EU. Then that is the direction the Parliament should take, and that is personally the view that I think it should take. And there should be more checks and balances and everything else like that in the EU. Like the EU needs to be more directly controlled by the people, but that's just me. Yeah, let's finish this off.
European languages as possible. A couple of European YouTubers narrated it and uploaded it to their own channels. Thank you to Funk and all YouTubers who helped us. You can find the playlist with all language versions in the description.
Kurtzgesagt is great. Go subscribe to Kurtzgesagt. Go like, subscribe, everything else like that. Do they have a Patreon? If they have a Patreon, go join the Patreon. Where is it? His voice. Doesn't look like they do. Go buy the merchandise. Go do everything else like that. They deserve all the love, happiness, and everything else like that in the world. They deserve everything. I love them so much. If you like my personal reaction and commentary on this, give me a like, give me a sub, give me all the other things. And yeah, that's about it. Love, butts, and happiness, and everything else like that. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.